It's July 2023. Adobe has just released the all-new Adobe Captivate, and you are probably a user of one of InfoSemantic's extensions for Adobe Captivate, such as CpExtra or perhaps CpMate. And what you want to know is, does CpExtra and CpMate support the new Adobe Captivate? And the answer is no. Now, that is not a no, we don't want to. That is a no, we are not physically able to change CpExtra and CpMate to be able to work in the all-new Adobe Captivate. And the reasons for that don't just affect these two extensions, they affect the larger world of JavaScript within inside Adobe Captivate, whether that is for developing large extensions or whether that is for just using those few lines of code that you found on the Adobe Captivate forum. So to discuss this, I want to break this video up into two sections. The first section, let's talk about what the current state of JavaScript development inside of the all-new Adobe Captivate is. And then for the second part, let's talk about, is there anything we can do to improve the situation? It kind of boggles the mind to think that next month, August 2023, will be 5 years since the last major version of Captivate was released. That's half a decade. And as those years have rolled on, at InfoSemantics, we've become increasingly pensive about putting too much work into CpExtra or in doing that JavaScript for Adobe Captivate course that we keep on talking about doing, because obviously the Adobe Captivate team have been working on something very big. Is anything that we build now going to be relevant in a couple months' time? So we've held back. And sure enough, DevLearn last year, there was the preview of the all-new Adobe Captivate, and we're like, okay, well, this seems to be very different. We really hope that the Adobe Captivate team has been taking notice of there being a burgeoning JavaScript community for Adobe Captivate appearing in the forums. So hopefully they've thought about what they're going to do to be able to make JavaScript even better in the new Adobe Captivate. Well, here it is now. So I'm not going to take you on a step-by-step view of the all-new Adobe Captivate. There's plenty of other videos that you can look at online to be able to do that. What I'm going to show you is just what the state for JavaScript development is. So let's go have a look. So the first thing to note about the all-new Adobe Captivate is that there are no web objects. There are no web objects. And just like that, that's CpMate gone. You can't have a product which is a bridge between Adobe Captivate and Adobe Animate if Captivate now has no way to import an Adobe Animate animation. So that is not great. The next thing is that there are widgets, but they are not custom widgets. There's not been any word on whether or not Adobe Captivate team is going to allow us to make our own widgets. Looking at how they're implemented, I'm going to say that that's very unlikely that it's going to happen. Variables have also been changed. We can find those by going to the project properties, going to the variable section and looking at the list of all variables. A lot of them are familiar. The names have been changed. I don't mind that the names have been changed. I prefer this naming style. I think that the previous names were probably a bit outdated. But what is strange is what variables have been chosen to stay in a Captivate and which ones have been taken out. For example, there is no variable here which tells you what version of Adobe Captivate is. And granted, if you are just a regular Adobe Captivate developer, there would not be any reason to use that. But if you are, say, developing an extension for Adobe Captivate, which you want to make sure is able to work in multiple versions of Adobe Captivate, so you need to know which version you're in to be able to make adjustments, that variable comes important. It's not there anymore. Also, there is no variable which tells us what frame the project is currently in. There's no equivalent of the CpInfo current frame variable. And that was very important for a lot of CpExtra's features and absolutely essential for CpMate to be able to keep the syncing between the Adobe Captivate timeline and the Adobe Animate timeline. that's another nail in the coffin for CpMate, unfortunately. Now, Adobe Captivate does have a documented JavaScript interface. It's called the Common JavaScript Interface for Adobe Captivate, and it's mostly accessible through the CpAPI interface object on the window. And there's lots of useful features inside of here, such as navigating to a certain time in the project, or getting the current frame, getting the current slide index. And if we go and look at the previous Captivate, if I just open up the console here, if I go CpAPI interface and spell it correctly, you can see all of this is here, and CpExtra makes a lot of use of these APIs. But if we go into the All New Captivate and into X export, we open up the JavaScript development environment and we go CpAPI interface. Okay, it's still there, that's good. But if we look at what has been implemented, it's very, very few items. And it is missing some brutally essential commands. For example, in the previous Captivate, CpAPI interface had a go to slide function, which was very basic. I want to go to slide 5. Now I can go to slide 5. I want to now jump to slide 15. I can do that. That's not on CpAPI interface. I can go to next slide, I can go to the previous slide, but if I want to go to a certain slide, skipping over slides in the middle, there's no way to do that inside of JavaScript now. And that is really 101. If you were teaching someone JavaScript inside of Adobe Captivate, the first example you would use is how you can use JavaScript to jump to a specific slide inside of Captivate. So the new CpAPI interface also doesn't have a function to change the state of an object like the other one did. And, well, that's goodbye to CpExtra's Smart States features, because there is no way inside of JavaScript now to change the state of a certain object. Now, while internally CpExtra did make a lot of use of CpAPI interface, what it did use most was the CP object. So if I go back to the previous Captivate, if I type in CP, you can see inside of here, there's a whole lot of internal APIs which are used for Adobe's code. And it's understandable this is not supported, but this was very useful for extensibility, for making sure that things could get done. There's a movie object here which could pause, play, do all sorts of commands. But if we go into the new Adobe Captivate, if we go to CP and type dot, we can see there is not nearly as many interfaces inside of here. In fact, most of them are useless to extension code. Now this becomes even more curious if we dig into the code which is running the all new Adobe Captivate. For example, here I have the main chunk, which is from the export files for the new Captivate. If I type inside here cp.movie.pause, it will find references to cp.movie.pause. Whereas if we type in cp.movie, here it's not available. So why did classic Adobe Captivate have so many internal APIs available for us to use, but the new Adobe Captivate doesn't? Well, that has to do with the technologies that the new Adobe Captivate is using. Now, under normal circumstances, if you wanted to know what technologies a product was using, you could do so by going to Help and the About page. Then usually under legal notices, you would see the terms and conditions for each of those open source products, which was used to be able to build, in this case, Adobe Captivate. But there's nothing listed here. And even if we go to this site for where it says it's got all the third-party softwares in it, Adobe Captivate is not listed here. This is a little bit concerning because the new Adobe Captivate is quite obviously making use of the React and Redux libraries. Now these are libraries which are very popular. They are developed by Facebook, but if you want to use them, it's very plainly stated in their usage terms that you need to include a copyright notice. That's nowhere inside of the new Adobe Captivate, so if the Captivate team is watching this, I would get onto that. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, maybe you consulted with lawyers, but I'm pretty sure Facebook, who built this, has lawyers, so I wouldn't want to meet with one of them. On another note, the internal code inside of Adobe Captivate is quite obviously making use of the GSAP library, which is an animation library. It's a really wonderful library, but it is not free for commercial use. You need to have a business license for that. So I hope the Adobe Captivate team did that. If I was the developer of GSAP, I would be going and checking, because they haven't put any third-party notices for any of the other software that they're using. So anyway, what does it mean now that Adobe Captivate is using the React and the Redux technologies? Well, these are very good technologies, but they work in an interesting way. What Redux does is it renders everything that you see inside of the web page, and it does this by holding what it calls a virtual DOM in memory, where it's got imagining a virtual web page, and the code that Adobe develops makes changes to that web page, and at the appropriate time, React goes and updates that web page. And it works along with Redux, which is a state management software, to be able to make sure that things work in an organized pattern. What that means is that unless any access was given to the React or Redux way of generating the visual design of Adobe Captivate, no extension could make any meaningful change to that. For example, I could not change the color of these buttons without meaning that the virtual DOM that React is using is going to start imagining things. Now, in the real world, I don't think it's practical to expect that the Adobe Captivate team would allow third-party developers to be able to interact with React and Redux. It's just too difficult. So that's another kind of extension which I think we're going to have to say goodbye to. Any visual change to the Adobe Captivate design language now needs to come exclusively from the Adobe Captivate team. Now, there is another technology which is being used within Adobe Captivate, which is perhaps an even greater change. And this comes back to those internal APIs that I was talking about. And that product is Webpack. If we go back inside of the file and we go all the way back up, we see the first thing it mentions here is window.webpack. Webpack solves a very essential problem for JavaScript developers, which is that we want to have our code in lots of little files when we're developing it, but when we deliver the code, we want it in one big file, such as this one with thousands and thousands of lines of code. We could not develop the entire Adobe Captivate export in a single file. That would be madness. So what Webpack does is it takes all of those little JavaScript files, it takes their content, it edits them a little bit to make sure that they are able to communicate with each other, and then packages them, encapsulates them inside of a single JavaScript file. Now, that's a key word that I just used there, encapsulate. It makes sure that the code runs inside of a capsule, so what's inside of the capsule can talk to itself, but what's outside of the capsule cannot. So that was not something that the previous Adobe Captivate would use, which meant that its internal APIs were basically open for extension code to mess with. But now that we are outside of the capsule, once again, there's very limited amount of things that we can do about that. And what it means is now, in the end of the day, anything that custom JavaScript does, it can only do that because the Adobe Captivate team have intentionally opened up the ability for custom JavaScript code to do that. Previously, what I would tell my clients was that inside of Adobe Captivate, everything is possible, not everything is practical. I now have to revise that statement due to these new technologies that the Adobe Captivate team is using, which, to be honest, I cannot criticize them for doing that because they are the right technologies to use for this kind of development. They do mean that Adobe Captivate is a lot more secure than it was before. I mean, if I was doing an Adobe Captivate course for a client and I was running through it myself, I knew that I had the ability to open up the JavaScript console and manually change my score that was sent to the LMS. So I can't do that now. So I suppose in the end that is a win. But the long and the short of it is that there is almost nothing that JavaScript can do inside of Captivate now, which is not a great situation. So with that in mind, is there anything we can do to improve the situation? Let's talk about that. Quite clearly, the Adobe Captivate team has been under a lot of pressure to be able to deliver the all-new Adobe Captivate with as many of the features of the previous Captivate as possible. So it's understandable that some, let's say, niche aspects to Captivate, such as JavaScript development, have not been their primary focus. So let's lighten their load. I would like to make this proposal to the Adobe Captivate team for how JavaScript inside of the all-new Captivate could work. And if you agree with this proposal, then let the Adobe Captivate team know about it. Whenever on the Adobe Captivate forums you ask about a feature, is this in the all-new Adobe Captivate? And they say, no, not yet. Then say, well, here's a proposal for how JavaScript could work inside of Adobe Captivate, and maybe someone would be able to use this to be able to implement it while we wait for the Adobe Captivate team to create new major versions for the primary Captivate tool. This method should be enjoyable for the developer to use, and it should also be able to keep the internal environment of the Adobe Captivate source code secure. So it comes down to 3 points. The first point, for goodness sake, give us a way to package the JavaScript code inside of the Captivate project. This shouldn't be too difficult to implement. All you would need to do is inside of the preferences window, have a field here somewhere where you can point to a JavaScript file, and then that gets brought in and saved within Captivate. And that means if I share this project file with someone else on my team or someone on the other side of the planet, I don't need to direct them through some very fragile process for loading the JavaScript into their project. They just have it there automatically, and it will run whether they are previewing the whole project, whether they are previewing one slide, and the tooling that develops out of that will make sure that it gets run at the right time. So that's number one. Just give us a way to be able to load at least one, ideally multiple, but at least one JavaScript file of custom code into the all-new Captivate. Number two, modules. Let's look at some code. So what I have here is a simplification of the Adobe Captivate environment. There is an internal CP object which has lots of interesting and fun to use and useful commands on it, which we would like our custom code to be able to use to be able to make it more powerful. Now, this is not available to the program as a whole. We don't want anyone who's just a student coming and accessing that information. That's understandable. So this is an example of what our custom code could look at, this JavaScript file which we would load into Adobe Captivate. It's using the module system. It's written as an ES module. It exports a function which could be named something like receive CP interface, and it will take a single parameter. And we want Captivate to pass us the internal API, the CP1, or whichever one's going to be able to allow us to change the slide. Then inside of Adobe Captivate, all you have to do is import this module. Now I am using a dynamic import statement for this, and I'll explain that in a moment, but we are just dynamically importing this custom code written by the JavaScript developer here. We extract that receive CP interface function, and then we just check that it's defined, and if it is, we pass in this internal CP interface. So when we go here at this example file here and I refresh, we can see, yes, the code has received the internal CP interface, and voila, we are now able to create extensions with Adobe Captivate using some of those internal APIs, and it's not leaked to the wider world. The third aspect of this system is in the export files, we need to keep the custom JavaScript code separate from the Adobe Captivate code. It would be tempting to use Webpack in order to bundle the custom code in with the main chunk here, but that on the surface would seem like a good idea. In practice, it would actually not, because that would mean that whenever the JavaScript developer wanted to change something about their code and test it, then they would need to republish Captivate to see how it works. But if in the export the code, the module just stays independent in the export files like this, then it means that we are able to use tooling to be able to replace that file very rapidly and then test in the background. And then that will make sure that we can build things quicker. This is not all that difficult to implement. I don't think it would take a lot of development time, and I do absolutely believe there is a lot to be gained from it, because it means that there's a lot of features inside of Adobe Captivate, the new Adobe Captivate, which is not there at the moment. But if we are able to use custom code, then we could develop some of those features into it while we wait for the Adobe Captivate team to catch up. So that's all I have to talk about today. If you agree with that proposal about how we could have a better JavaScript environment inside of the all-new Adobe Captivate, then whenever you have an opportunity on the Adobe Captivate forums, just link to this video to keep it in front of the Adobe Captivate team. If we don't talk about this, if we don't make it known that we want something better, then nothing is going to change. So the all-new Adobe Captivate, it's a completely new product. It's a completely new way of looking at e-learning. And if we're going to build extensions for it in the future, then we're going to need all new extensions, because it's just too different. So for the moment, Classic Captivate is going to still be supported for another couple of years, but depending on how things go, it's quite likely that the user base for Classic Captivate is going to slowly die down. So while we will still support and maintain CpExtra and CpMate for years to come, we're not going to be actively developing them. But we do very much thank you for all of your attention that you've given and all of the love and support that you've given for CpExtra and CpMate throughout the years. And hopefully this is not the end of the story, but we have to see. If you have any other ideas for how to improve using JavaScript inside of Adobe Captivate, I would be very interested to hear them. You can put them down below. But until the next time, I guess I see you around.